Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We're a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. This afternoon, or this morning, excuse me, for most of us, maybe afternoon for some of you, we're going to be talking about an important relationship. I know we've all been glued to the events in Eurasia and Ukraine. However, some would characterize this as the most important of the United States bilateral relationships, that of the U.S. and China. And to speak about it this afternoon, or this morning, this morning, we have two distinguished scholars, Roger Cliff and Ren Qiao. And moderating the event today will be Jacques Delisle, who is the director of FPRI's Asia program. He's also the Stephen A. Cousin Professor of Law and Political Science and director of the Center of the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. This program today is under the banner of both our Asia program and our new China Center. And I'd like to give a shout out to Jim and Janet Averill, without whom we would not have a China Center, and thank them for their generous support. I'd also like to thank members of our audience, our members of FPRI, and our supporters and donors and any board members who are on the event today. If you have questions, we'll be taking them, and just put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll also be putting out some maps, links to maps in our chat for your use as well, if you want to orient yourself. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jacques Delisle.
Well, thank you, Raleigh, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm going to give our panelists a brief introduction, and then we'll get right to it because we have a lot of ground to cover. So joining us today are Ren Qiao. Professor Ren is currently Professor of International Politics at the Institute of International Studies and the Director of the Center for the Study of Chinese Foreign Policy at Fudan University in Shanghai. Before that, he served at the Shanghai Institute for International Studies, and as the China Hands in the audience know, that's one of China's leading think tanks, and Fudan is one of China's top universities. He's been the editor of New Frontiers in China's Foreign Relations and China's Foreign Aid Theory and Practice. His work has appeared in major journals in the US and in China. He also previously worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China, including serving in China's embassy in Tokyo from 2010 to 2012. Our other panelist is Roger Cliff. Professor Cliff is Research Professor of Indo-Pacific Affairs at the U.S. Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute. He works primarily on China's military strategy and capabilities and their implications for U.S. strategy and policy. He's written many books, articles, reports, and book chapters. You can find them in all the usual suspect places. He previously worked at the Center for Naval Analyses, the Atlantic Council, the Project 2049 Institute, the RAND Corporation, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And for those of you who know U.S. foreign policy, you know those are the hangouts for people who do great work in this space. So without further ado, let's turn to our topic today. We just hit the 50th anniversary of the Shanghai Communique, really the foundational document for the normalization of U.S.-China relations and the growth of U.S.-China relations over the 5 decades that followed. We're also about a month past Vladimir Putin's visit to Beijing on the eve of the Olympics, where a joint statement was issued that promised, I think, limitless cooperation between China and Russia. And of course, the China-Soviet relationship was the backdrop to the Shanghai Communique. So we've had a lot happen, a lot of ups and downs in U.S.-China relations over those 50 years, and I think everybody would agree we're in a complicated and in some ways fraught moment right now. So I want to turn the first question to Ren Qiao, which is you've been involved in the implementation and the study of U.S.-China relations for quite some time now. And in particular, what do you think about 1 year, we're about a little more than 1 year into the Biden administration, is Biden policy, Biden-era U.S. policy toward China what you expected, say a year and a half ago? And to what extent do you see it as continuing the patterns of the Trump era or as departing from what I think most would agree was a particularly complicated time in U.S.-China relations during the 4 years preceding 2020. Professor Ren?
Thank you, Jack. Before I address your questions specifically, just a few words as a context, so to speak. Today's China is very different from China 40 years ago. It is no longer a poor country. It has achieved economic growth over the past 40 years or so. And today it has a considerable middle class. And on the whole, people in China today living a better life than 40 years ago. And also they enjoy much more freedom than 40 years ago. And in the meantime, there are, of course, problems we ourselves complain about. For example, high housing price, about education, about medical care, and so forth. However, generally speaking, I believe people in China have reasons to be proud of their achievements over the years, which are not small achievements. And one of the reasons is that is because of that China has built, generally speaking, a peaceful and stable external environment. And of course, the United States is a key part of this external environment. In terms of China's foreign policy, on the whole, China today is a responsible power in the world. Well, to address your specific question, I believe that China is expecting more from the Biden administration, but the changes of U.S. policies have not been as satisfactory or as fast as we have expected. And as everyone knows, the relationship between U.S. and China underwent a very big change, very big changes over the Trump years, very big challenges and downward spiral over those 4 years. So we hope that we hope for changes of U.S.-China policies by the Biden administration. And in terms of China's policy towards the United States, I think we can see more continuity than change in terms of China's policy toward the United States. We always hope for a stable, smooth transition to a new U.S. administration. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sure a similar question to Roger Cliff. To what extent do you think the Biden administration's policy is something that China should have expected, and the degree to which you see it as continuous versus discontinuous from the Trump era, which is a little bit tough, of course, because the Trump era itself contains some somewhat contradictory signals in China policy. Roger? I think you're muted. There you go.
Sorry, first of all, I need to start out with my standard disclaimer that the views I'm about to present are my own and not those of the U.S. Army War College, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government, or as Jacques likes to say, the Intergalactic Federation. Although I've heard that there are some policy changes afoot in the Intergalactic Federation. So, so maybe my views will line up with them after all. Joking aside, these are my personal views. And I guess I would, to answer your question, Jacques, I would say even I maybe have been a little bit surprised by some aspects of the Biden administration's policy. In particular, I thought they would move pretty quickly to lift the tariffs that have been imposed on Chinese imports and so on. But with regard to the overall harder line, perhaps than may have been expected, to me, that's not much of a surprise. Last time I talked about this, I mentioned an article by Harry Harding in the Washington Quarterly in 2015, in which he basically assessed that the consensus that had existed since Nixon's visit in 1972, really, about policy towards China, which could be described as constructive engagement, had broken down. And it had broken down, for a variety of reasons. One could even say it was, in a sense, too successful. As Professor Run was just saying, China has experienced tremendous economic growth over that period. And standards of living in China are much higher than they have ever been. And China has become a full-fledged participant in the international system. And all of these things were goals of that policy. However, Harding points out that a couple of things that people were hoping for didn't happen. One was democratization in China. And the other was that as China became more enmeshed and integrated into the international system, the hope was that its actions would be constrained, and that it would have to sort of follow the rules of the American and European established liberal international order, and that hasn't happened. And so therefore, I think there was, and I realize I may be jumping ahead to answer another question. I think it was inevitable that there would be a shift in U.S. foreign policy. And the Trump administration, I think, accelerated that shift and probably overshot. But we were never going to go back to the policies that had been pursued by previous administrations under the Biden administration. And, that was sort of signaled, I think, by the appointment of people like Kurt Campbell and Eli Ratner, who, although, solid Democrats, have been relatively hardline on China.
Okay, so your project list has just identified some of the reasons that we've seen a tougher line toward China in U.S. policy under Trump and under Biden, including for those who were sort of maximally optimistic, I guess one could say, about constructive engagement, that it would lead to political change inside China, to sort of convergence with Western-style democratic norms, and more modestly, that China's engagement with international institutions would, in the international relations jargon, socialize, right? Sort of social states, the constructivist view that it would change China's behavior. Implicit in that critique is, of course, an argument from the U.S. that China has been somewhat subversive of norms that the U.S., or at least opposed norms that the U.S. Sought to promote. We could add a bunch more things to that list, and we may turn back to those, but I first want to give Ren Xiao a chance to say, from the Chinese perspective, what's been the source of the deterioration in the U.S.-China relationship?
Well, let me put it this way. The one big change on China's part is China is no longer a revolutionary state in world politics. China used to be a revolutionary in world affairs. China used to support national liberation movements throughout the world. China was engaged in those radical political changes or armed struggles, so-called violent struggles in some Southeast Asian countries, for example, China is no longer such a state in international politics. I think that's a very important thing to understand change of China. So I would think it's a successful, China has successfully transformed to a more peace-loving country in the region and in the world. And this, of course, I guess some people would say would have a different opinions, but it's okay. We can discuss. So, in that sense, engagement policy has succeeded. If we argue that engagement, the purpose of engagement is not to bring about a democratic China that some observers may have hoped to see. A democratic China in the Western sense, American sense, kind of thing. And so one question that need to be discussed was that the purpose of U.S. engagement policy, or how do we understand the engagement policy? And in my opinion, engagement has succeeded in the sense that I'm talking about. So and that should continue. If we do not continue engagement, that would mean disengagement from China, and a disengagement from China would be would be very different, of course, in all kinds of in various areas. Thank you.
So I want to pick up on that last thread. As Roger well knows, there's been a debate within the United States about whether constructive engagement failed, and that depends a little bit on what you thought it was supposed to do. So much of that, one punctuated moment in that long period of constructive was China's entry into the WTO in 2000, and part of the way that the removal of U.S. opposition to that was sold domestically in the U.S. was to make the claim that deeper engagement with China, particularly on the economic side with the WTO, but also more broadly, would lead to changes within China, and that the failure to effectuate those kinds of changes to Western-style democracy suggested a failure of constructive engagement. I've always thought that was a bit overblown, and that constructivism, that strand, was really about China's international behavior, and we'll turn to that in a moment. But do you share that view, Roger, that constructive engagement really was about China's international behavior, and that we just sort of larded on for domestic reasons, this notion that it would change China internally in profound ways? And did that set it up to fail politically in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I do, or at least in my view, somewhat a historical claim that that this policy of constructive engagement failed because China isn't a democracy. I think that's misleading. That was a hope associated with the policy, but it wasn't the sole basis for it. And I agree with you that an important, maybe the most important component of it was the idea of at least integrating, as I said, China into the international system, socializing it into the norms of behavior that are expected of participation, countries participating in the liberal international order. But I will also say one other thing, which was there was a practical aspect to this, which was if the U.S. had pursued a different kind of policy, one of containment or disengagement, as Professor Run just described it, we would have been alone in that. There were no other countries, major countries in the world that would have supported that. Not our allies in Asia like Japan and South Korea, not even Taiwan for that matter, and not the countries of Europe. The view of many of these countries was that China was an opportunity to make money, and this was a view of many, if not the majority of people in the U.S., and not a security threat to the world. And so therefore, if the U.S. had decided to, we're not going to engage with China, then we would have just sort of stood on the sidelines and watched other people make money in China, was the concern. And the people were well aware of that at the time. There was a small group of people who were more alarmist and were concerned about China being a security threat in the future, but the majority of people saw China primarily as an economic opportunity for the U.S. and one that we didn't want to pass by. And I think that was the primary motivation for our policy at the time. And I wouldn't say larded on for the idea about democratization, but it was a hope. It wasn't the fundamental premise of the policy.
So I think that's a nice review of the background of how this all got started and evolved. I think it's fair to say that the belief that U.S. policy will have a significant impact on changing China's domestic order is now not really in the repertoire of feasible policy goals. But I also wanted to pick up on another thread in Roger's very nice description of where the world was when we started this process. So to turn this question to Ren Xiao, well, I think Roger's absolutely right that the U.S. was somewhat behind the curve in fully engaging with China. Yes, the Shanghai Communique was 50 years ago, but it took nearly a decade more to normalize relations. And now, however, what one hears sometimes from Chinese sources is that one of the sources of friction in U.S.-China relations is, well, two of them. One, the U.S. is still trying to change China internally. We heard that at the Alaska standoff between Wang Yi and Jake Sullivan, Yang Jiechi, and Anthony Blinken. The Chinese response was the U.S. is still trying to change China internally, and that's a problem. And the other response is that the U.S. is now aligning with many of those other countries that were for engaging China decades ago, countries like Japan, other democracies in the region. The U.S. is trying to align them against China to keep China down, whether it's the Quad or AUKUS or any of those moves. So, Professor Ren, I want to ask you, how do you see that view, and how do you think that view is seen in China? That the source of friction now is the U.S. is still trying to change China internally, and the U.S. is trying to rally other states, primarily democratic states, to contain China?
Well, thank you. Maybe you have noticed that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan last year made some remarks that the Biden administration has no intention to change China's system of government. I think that was a response to the Chinese government's concerns. If the two countries, two major powers, so significant for the world, can have a mutual understanding of this issue, that the other side, in this case, as the United States, does not intend to change China's internal political system, and that would be favorable for the two major powers to maintain a normal and stable relationship. Second thing is that in the eyes of China, the U.S. administration has been building coalitions or alliances, such as Quad, which involving U.S., Japan, Australia, and India, and also Australia, U.S., UK, U.S., UK, Australia, U.S., UK, AUKUS, and also Five Eyes, which is an intelligence sharing organization. So understandably, there are widespread skepticisms on the part of China about U.S. motives and so forth. I think the two governments, well, the past 2 years, because of COVID-19, has been impacted so much that another factors, it has been affected so much that there are much less communication or dialogues between the two governments, and when COVID subsides and international travel becomes more normal, I think the two governments should make efforts to achieve a better, more dialogues and exchange views on various issues between them, and to increase mutual understandings between them on all kinds of issues, and that would help alleviate the mutual suspicions by increasing exchange of views and mutual understanding. Thank you.
In his earlier remarks, Professor Ren discussed China's external behavior, and one of the things he stressed was China abandoning the policy that it pursued occasionally during the Mao years of world revolution, sort of destabilizing, and described China as now being a peaceful actor in international relations. We've just talked about the alignments the U.S. has been pursuing with countries along China's periphery in the security realm. So I want to turn to Roger Cliff and say, what's behind that? Clearly, it's a perception that China is not entirely reliably peaceful, perhaps, or at least has an agenda that conflicts with the security interests of Taiwan and of various states along China's periphery. Would you care to speak to that side of the U.S. motivation for that behavior and why it doesn't take that description of China necessarily as accurate, the peaceful engagement with the international system?
Yeah, so let me start out by saying I agree with Professor Ren that China, I believe he talked about the debate about whether or not China, which is ongoing also in the U.S. right now, about whether or not China is a revisionist power or not. But clearly China doesn't engage in the kind of behavior that it did in the past of trying to foment revolutions, Marxist revolutions in countries around the world. So I definitely agree with that. I think the U.S. efforts, and again, I'm speaking for myself, not I don't have any inside knowledge about U.S. government policy, but I think there has been a hardening of U.S. government views towards China, and although I would not describe U.S. Strategy and policy in the past, until very recently anyways, as one of containment toward China, and I probably still wouldn't, but I think there is a more realpolitik type of motivation behind U.S. policy. That's why you see the U.S. getting close to countries like Vietnam, which aren't exactly democracies. So that I would say there is an effort going on to try to counterbalance China, and there's two reasons for that. I would say one is just your classic security dilemma of a country whose relative power is increasing compared to the established power, and so people in the established power will necessarily view that with concern. But I think also one can point to in recent years China being more assertive about some of its territorial claims and other issues. Now, I should say that none of this has involved an actual use of force. But the Defense Department's become quite interested in so-called gray zone activities, that is, use of military power or national security forces like Coast Guards or maritime militia in activities that fall short of actual war. And so just a few examples are China's building up of the facilities on the islands in the South China Sea that it has long claimed and previously occupied, but with very small forces, and has built them up into quite substantial military bases now. The ongoing incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, the confrontation between China. Sorry, I see Professor Ren wants to interject. Let me just finish my list. And the confrontation between China and Japan over the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands, and also with the Philippines over Scarborough Reef. So, and I'll let Professor Ren speak in a moment, but all of these things are perceived on the US side as signs of a China that's more assertive or even aggressive. And there's really been a shift, I would say, in the US foreign policy establishment, particularly, frankly, within the Department of Defense, whereas 10 years ago, people that I spoke to in the DoD were, many of them, not all of them, but many of them thought China was not a national security concern of the United States, or that any things that it threatened were not for security interests of the United States. And and that has definitely changed. Now, whether or not that perception is, or interpretation of those events is correct or not, I won't speak to, but that's how it's viewed in the U.S. Sorry.
So, I know you want to respond to this. So we've got a couple of different explanations that Professor Cliff has suggested. One is the sort of structural power shift, the sort of Mearsheimer, Graham Allison view that a rising power and a previously dominant power are going to come to some friction, as well as a more specific set of activities where there's more choice, more agency, that the U.S. perceives as signaling an assertive and potentially aggressive China, particularly in territorial claims. So here's your chance to respond, Professor Ren.
I want to add an important fact, that is, today's China is a part of almost all the international institutions, agreements, or covenants. You name it, almost all of them. So in that sense, I would argue that basically China is a status quo power. China has grown up within the existing international order or system. So there's no incentive for China to overthrow the existing international order. What about those existing disputes or problems? There are a number of problems in the region, and many of them are long-standing problems. They have been left over by history. For example, between mainland China and Taiwan, it has been left over by China's civil war. They were defeated and they fled to Taiwan, and this has continued. Between China and Japan, maritime demarcation in East Asia has never been carried out, I would say. So when the law of the sea began to take effect in 1982, and according to the law of the sea, China has 200 nautical miles of exclusive economic zone, EEZ. Japan has the same EEZ, 200 nautical miles. But East China Sea is not as wide as 400 nautical miles wide. So inevitably, there's an overlapped part of East China Sea. But maritime demarcation has never been carried out. So there is an issue between China and Japan. And in addition to it, there's a 钓鱼 Senkaku dispute. Also, the Korean Peninsula is another issue. The nuclear problem is a long-standing issue, and neither United States nor China wants to see a nuclear weapon-armed DPRK. So there is an overlapped, a common interest in there, and there's a possibility for China and US to work together in the future. They did in the past years, and there's a possibility for them to cooperate on that particular issue. In South China Sea, even more complicated because it involves more countries or actors. And China's position is that, well, it's complex enough, and we hope other powers, including the United States, is not going to add oil to the fire, as we say, 火上浇油. So please allow the regional countries, the parties in the region, to talk with each other and to work out a code of conduct for the South China Sea. And so forth. So there are a number of regional problems, and all of them are very complex. And let's allow more time for the countries in the region to work out a way out. Thank you.
Okay, before I weigh in on that, Roger, do you have a response you want to make to this, or?
Not really. Everything Professor Wren said sounded reasonable to me. So I mean, we can argue about some of the specifics, but I think he's correct that these are problems left over from history. And all I will say is that the U.S. perception of China has changed in part, not entirely, but in part because China seems to be more eager to resolve these problems, whereas in the past it would merely lodge verbal protests, and now it seems to be trying to use material capabilities more. And that's not a surprise, given that China's material capabilities are much greater than they were a few decades ago. But that as going back to the security dilemma, where actions on the part of one country to protect its legitimate interests, what are seen as its legitimate interests, can be alarming to another power. And in the United States in particular, we often have an assumption in our foreign policy that everything else being equal, we ought to the status quo ought to be preserved. That preserving the status quo is the preferred state, except when it's in our interest to change it. But if you're in a position like China, where you feel many China's leaders and many people in China feel that the status quo is unjust, then that's not the preferred state of affairs. And it's only natural that a country would try to change that. But nonetheless, that is provoking concern in the United States.
Yeah, I think we've many of the issues that are currently sources of friction, of territorial sovereignty disputes are notoriously difficult to sort out. That tends to be something of a zero-sum game among rival claimants, and there's no one clear metric, historical, territorial, population based for resolving it. The law of the sea issues have become quite fraught as well. The famous Philippines-China arbitration, where the tribunal, the jurisdiction of which China refuted or rejected, issued a decision that sided pretty heavily with the Philippines. The U.S. obviously has a very different view of maritime zones than China does. The complexity here, of course, is part that the U.S. has never signed on to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, although we insist those principles are customary international law. But I think both Professor Wren and Professor Cliff are right that the kinds of things we've been talking about here, although potentially very significant points of friction and conflict, both sides are purporting to argue, at least within the existing rules, right? It's a different interpretation of how sovereignty and law of the sea applies, and obviously there are deep disagreements about those interpretations. But I want to widen the frame a little bit, and because we've touched upon this idea of revisionist powers, and to what extent, and I'll pose this to both of you, does each country itself seek to change the rules of the international system, or see the other as trying to change the rules in problematic ways? So again, in many of the territorial and maritime disputes, we can argue about where you go from questionable interpretations into flat-out revisionism, but there are other areas on the table too: human rights, use of force, things like that. So if I had to ask each of you to hit a couple of areas where China seeks to change the system, or seeks to be something a revisionist power, or where the U.S. does, what would you put on that list for each country? I'll start with Ren Xiao.
Well, if we use the term revisionist or revisionism, I would say that for quite a few observers in China, the United States is more a revisionist power than China is. Why? Well, they say, look, U.S. pulled out of many international agreements or institutions. The Trump administration withdrew from World Health Organization, withdrew from Paris Agreement on climate change, withdrew from TPP, and so on and so forth. And there was or reportedly there was a possibility for the Trump administration to withdraw from NATO. Well, in that sense, the U.S. was or is more revisionist than China for those Chinese observers. I think there's some truth to it. Speaking of China, does it want to change the international system? I think China does believe that there are unjust and unreasonable elements in the existing international order, and they need to be reformed. It's unrealistic to bring about a revolutionary change. Again, so in China's view, it's those unjust and unreasonable elements or parts of the existing international order should be reformed in an incremental way. So it is. So I have an argument. I have a term to put it. It's by saying that China is a reform-minded status quo power. Thank you.
And is Roger, same question to you?
Yeah, so just a couple of comments. So, I mean, I think China and the United States are very similar, and I'll even accept Professor Run's position that one could argue that the U.S. Has been, I wouldn't say necessarily that we're a revisionist power, but we do have a tendency to act outside of the rules of the international order when it suits us, as I alluded to earlier. And there are institutions that the U.S. has either never joined, like the International Criminal Court, or withdrawn from, like the International Court of Justice or World Court. The United States has used force under pretext that kind of stretch the definition of self-defense and so on. So, and that's how great powers operate. And I would say China is or becoming or has become a great power as well. And so there are going to be times, and I would argue actually the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is an example where China has signed it and ratified it, but seems to have what can be at best described as an idiosyncratic interpretation of some of its provisions, whereas the U.S. has signed it but never ratified it. So, but I would say that's an example of what great powers do, which is they set up systems that suit them, and when the system doesn't suit them, and China's coming into a system that was set up by the U.S. and European powers, then they try to change it from within, which is what China's doing, and that's to be expected. Or if they find it too constraining, then they act outside of it. And again, I would agree with Professor Run that China has focused more on operating within the system and trying to change it in ways that are in China's interest, even compared to the U.S., which tends to go outside of the system when it's in its interest to do so.
Yes, international laws for little countries. All right, so we're coming somewhat near the end of our time here, and I do want to get in questions from the audience. So I'll start with a very specific one and then broaden to some larger ones. And this one's directed particularly to you, Roger Cliff. It says, on September 9th, 2020, in a congressional hearing, you predicted that Beijing was likely to take a major tough action against Taiwan in 2 years. It's been a year and a half. What's your prediction now? And of course, the backdrop to this is, recent developments in another territorial dispute, which we may get into at the end, but not for this question.
Okay. Well, I would have to review the transcript to see if I predicted that. Having learned my lesson over the years, I probably didn't predict that. I probably said something like it's possible or more likely than in the past. I do remain concerned about China taking a more dramatic step with regard to Taiwan. That doesn't necessarily mean an invasion or any other kind of use of force, but of ramping up the pressure on Taiwan. I would say in the near term, I don't think Xi Jinping wants to provoke a crisis in the run-up to the 20th Party Congress in the fall, where he hopes to stay on for a third term as president and general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. But I do remain concerned about the situation across the Taiwan Strait. And I think a number of U.S. leaders in the U.S. defense establishment have also expressed concern as well. So I'll leave it at that. I'm just going to leave it at that. Sorry.
And Rich, our questioner asks for your views on that too. Do you see the risks of a Taiwan Strait conflict, a kinetic conflict, actual crisis that could lead to use of force? Do you see that possibility increasing?
Well, if we are forced to use force, that will be a disaster for everyone. It will be a disaster for everyone. So this is something that we should do our best. The parties should do our best to avoid. PRC has been patient on the issue of reunification. To have allowed more time for interactions or exchanges across the Taiwan Strait, for more contacts, more movement, and so forth, people to people, and to increase understand, to allow the two sides to know each other, and we do not have to rush for reunification. However, the trend is worrying. If we have followed what have been going on at U.S. Congress, for example, they have been doing this and that over the past years. They have been doing many things to hollowing out the one China policy. For example, to upgrade the contact between U.S. government and Taiwan, to eliminate the previous restrictions, enacted this act and that act, and so forth. So that is a worrying tendency on the U.S. part, and increasing risk, I would say.
Okay, I'd offer one bit of reassurance there, which is that yes, these are absolutely things Congress does. Congress's ability to control executive action in foreign affairs, particularly on these kinds of issues, has been somewhat limited. But I take the point, and a lot of it I think reflects, and I think Roger would probably agree with me on this, a lot of it the general deterioration in U.S.-China relations, that we've moved into a perspective from the U.S. side that the relationship is bad enough that there are few marginal costs to being more supportive of Taiwan, and of course many in the U.S. would take the view that some of what the U.S. has done is in response to China's increased pressure on Taiwan, and I think we'd all worry about the escalatory dynamic that could create. It's been in cross-strait issues, become more fraught clearly since 2016, and I think we can point to examples from all three sides of that relationship that have led to that. One thing I want to get to before we close here, and the Taiwan discussion is sort of a segue into this. Not surprisingly, given the moment at which we're holding this event, there are questions about the implications of the Ukraine war for China's behavior and China's policies generally. So I'll give Professor Ren at least nearly the last word on this, which is how should we understand the impact of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine on U.S.-China relations generally, and particularly in the context of various Taiwan scenarios, since, as you are aware, there's been a lot of attempt to figure out what that analogy is. Does China draw the lesson that therefore it's more or less feasible to take more assertive action against Taiwan? Professor Ren?
Well, this is certainly the hot topic and the most prominent issue these days. China cannot support Putin or Russia's military operations. We cannot support that. And in the meantime, we do not want to be seen as a part of the united front of the Western countries. So we try to be in the middle, somewhere between the two, and that posture has allowed China to play a mediating role if and when possible. And this is something that some observers are talking about. Also that there was some voice from EU saying that, well, China should play a positive role, an important role on the issue of the war in Ukraine. I think that's possible when conditions are ripe. So maybe that is a good thing, that China's position on this particular issue allows it to play a mediating role sometime in the future. Second, well, I would. Prime Minister Wang Yi appeared before the press conference during the two sessions. According to Foreign Minister Wang Yi, the Ukraine issue and the Taiwan issue, they are very different. The ongoing war is between two sovereign states, Russia and Ukraine. Taiwan is a part of China. So they are very different. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, as so often happens in fraught security situations, there's a war of analogies that goes on, and of course, as you know, there are many in Taiwan who have said that this would be a similar invasion and alignment of democracies and all that sort of stuff. Tons to discuss there, and I don't mean to unfairly leave a last statement out there unaddressed, but I will say this. That we are going to be doing a session, we're going to be in several sessions at FPRI, primarily under our Eurasia program, on the situation in Ukraine and what it means. We'll be doing one that's particularly focused on the China angle. That'll be coming up, I believe, 2 weeks from today. So people who want to hear more on that, please tune in. I'll be there with Chris Miller, my colleague from the Eurasia program here at FPRI. Again, we could go on a long time. I'm sorry we couldn't get to quite all the questions, or either on my list or in the Q&A function, but I think we've had a really rich discussion. I thank you both for being frank and for being, I think, quite respectful of the divergent viewpoints on this, and thank you everyone in the audience. Thank you, Professor Enshao, Professor Roger Cliff, for joining us today, and please do join us for future FPRI Asia programs. Again, we have the Ukraine-themed one coming up in a couple of weeks. We'll be doing a book talk with Isaac Stone-Fish on his book on how American elites have been strengthening China, and much more to come. I should also mention that Enshao has been a visitor here at Penn's China Center for the last month or so, and it's been great to have him around. And I thank everyone again for joining us today. Again, if you enjoyed this program, please tune in for more, and please also consider supporting and joining the Foreign Policy Research Institute. You can find links in the chat function for that. So again, everyone, good afternoon. See you next time.
Thank you, and the FPRI.